Focus for today's class is the New Negro Movement and the Harlem Renaissance. You want to be able to define these terms here. You want to analyze the sources using this sheet, and then you want to answer the questions after analyzing the source. We're going to start off with this introduction question. What should African Americans do to obtain equality? You want to consider the events studied over the past few classes: the Red Summer, Tulsa destruction, the lynching that have taken place, and want to figure out how are we going to secure change. I want to think about this from a debate point of view. What should be done? What should not be done? Are we going to rely on black institutions? Are we going to continue to have a separate America? One white, one black. For today's assignment, we're going to be using a Google slideshow. Everybody has the ability to edit this slideshow. And there are three things that you're going to do. Number one, you'll work in teams to complete this chart. I expect to see 4 or 5. If there are 4 groups, I expect to see 4 of these charts completed, 1 by each group. The same thing here for task 2, task 3, and task 4. What you're going to do is go into this slideshow, open up this slide, copy it, and then paste your own, put your names on it, and you'll do the same thing for this one as well as this one here. First thing we're going to look at is this particular question here. What are the possible solutions? These are the options here, and what are the pros and cons of all of these? Some we've already looked at: the moral suasion, self-defense, book learning. We've talked a little bit about that. W.E.B. Du Bois, the debate between him and Booker T. Washington. Once we're done with the chart, a quick timeline of events. For the most part, we are going to be in this particular area here for the next couple of classes, looking at the Great Migration and the Harlem Renaissance. And we started out with the Civil War, segregation. Then we wind up getting the federal support for segregation, and then of course the violence that has taken place. There's going to be some success with Black Wall Street, but then Black Wall Street is going to be targeted as a result of the economic competition presented by that particular part of town. The Roaring Twenties, this is when this is taking place, is all about change. When there's change, people usually like to resist. And that's exactly what we're going to see here with this Great Migration. As African Americans are leaving, wherever it is they're going, Detroit, New York City, Los Angeles, they are going to bring their culture, their dance, their style, speech patterns, you name it, they're bringing it. This is going to be culture fusion, and the end result is that people in these areas where they go are either going to accept the change, embrace it, or they're going to reject it. For example, the people in LA, are they going to be supportive of this new group of Africans moving into their town? This is an image from the Harlem Renaissance depicting life. And, it seems to be that joyful occasion, that time period that Alvin White had talked about. As I said before, they're going to bring culture, speech, way of life, dress, and this counts for any group, whether we're talking about a Jewish ghetto in 1920 Chicago. The Jewish people are going to bring their religion, their culture, their identity, everything with them. Same story, just a different group. We're going to transition to the New Negro Movement. I've put in place this chart with some of the leaders. Keep in mind that some would possibly represent the old Negro, possibly Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois. He's right there at the transition period. But what's going to happen is that this New Negro movement is going to be triggered by those atrocities like Tulsa. This I want to treat as a term, the nadir. This is a negative, horrible time period that they're living through. And one of the ways they're going to try to overcome that negative time period is to embrace some of this new culture through music, this black aesthetic, and they're going to try to change that perception that the rest of society has about Black Americans. Harlem Renaissance, we've already addressed this a couple of times. The Harlem Renaissance, that exodus to Harlem, and that community that develops in that particular part of New York City. So we have some of the leaders, new leaders of this particular thought process, which is why I asked the question, how are you going to secure change? And we see some of the differences among the individuals here. For example, Ida B. Wells, concerned about suffrage. Marcus Garvey was trying to go back to Africa. And Alan Locke was trying to come up with that aesthetic look. And we already talked about these two individuals. Now let's look at some of the individuals from this New Negro movement. And the first thing that we're going to look at is this particular passage here, which is an excerpt from the New Negro. In this section, they give you a brief summary. Here he's talking about a change that is happening in the American Negro. It brings up the younger generation, that they have a new psychology, a new spirit. And this is going to be very different. When we looked at the difference between Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, Booker T. Washington, born when slavery was still around, probably influenced the way he wanted to answer the question about achieving equality, whereas Du Bois, born after slavery had ended, definitely has a different approach. As you look more into this particular section, they uses the term New Negro, talks about a metamorphosis, and that's pretty much what this section is going to be about. It's going to be about that new Negro that is starting to develop in the 1920s and how they have a different way of looking at the racial problem as well as looking at themselves in America. I'm just going to look at a couple of items from this document because you have to figure out how to analyze them on your own. But the mind of the Negro in comparison to this new Negro that is going to emerge, the psychology of imitation and implied inferiority. Then he talks about how we have been almost as much of a problem to ourselves as we still are to others, which is important because he's trying to say that you have the responsibility to challenge some of these beliefs and to not live up possibly to this particular perception. Have self-respect, self-dependence. The life of the Negro community is bound to enter a new dynamic phase, and that phase that he's talking about is that new Negro, which is very different from the old. Notice here how they bring up the term Uncle Tom. We have already addressed that. Those days are gone. As he mentions here, equally gone. The new Negro has a different outlook on life. In this section, the author mentions the Great Migration, brings up the issue of sectionalism. An African American from the North, according to his view, would be very similar to one from the South, even the West. Their experience is going to be similar. Sadly, down here, he talks about American democracy and our lifetime, the Negro should not be able to celebrate his full initiation into American democracy. What he is advocating for is some sort of spiritual coming of age. The task, define the new Negro. Additional task is to create this chart here. Link the reading to the vicious cycle that is here. What blame is placed on the old? Compare the old to the new Negro. The second source we're going to analyze here is by Langston Hughes. This one has a couple of language issues as it does use the N-word. And what Langston Hughes is doing here is he's looking at the white poet and he's saying that the black poet has a choice to make. Is the black poet going to try to become a white poet through his writing? Or is he going to become a Negro poet? And I guess the difference would be what you're writing about. As he mentions down here, he takes a couple of shots at what he calls the Negro middle class. We have, I'll put poor people, the Negro middle class, and then we'll just put wealthy here. And, this right here might change the perception within this particular community of each other, because as he mentions here, they're no means rich yet, uncomfortable, nor hungry, smug, contented. He's arguing that these individuals, they've elevated a little bit, But as a result of their elevation, they don't consider themselves to be fully black, or at least that's not what they want to aspire to be. As he mentions here, they're reading white papers and magazines, and the mother often says, which is an odd reference because here we're talking about the Negro middle class and how the Negro middle class is trying to detach itself from the rest of society that white America views negatively. In this section, he continues looking at the high-class Negro. The father is perhaps a doctor, lawyer, landowner, politician. Talks about the mother being a social worker. The father is dark, but usually marries the lightest woman he can find. Are we trying to be like white folks? And then down here, he looks at the majority. And what we're starting to see here is you have African Americans, and then you have I'll put down regular African Americans, and then you have the Negro middle class. And from white America's point of view, this is all the same. But this group right here is trying to change, and the author seems to have issue with that. In this section, Langston Hughes is trying to outline what he believes would be the real goal of the Negro artist, the American Negro artist, as he mentions here, and how this individual has a choice. We'll put down Negro artist. Are they going to try to be white artists, or are they going to be Negro artists? If you're going to be a Negro artist, that means you are going to be writing and painting and doing things that represent what it means to be black in America. The question here is, will white America be able to understand, or is the black experience so vastly different that it's going to be something that just seems foreign to the white viewer of that particular piece of art? Here the author uses a couple of examples of black artists. Charles Gilpin acted for years in Negro theaters without any special acclaim from his own. The Negro artist works against an undertow of sharp criticism and misunderstanding from his own group and unintentional bribes from the whites. Oh, be respectable, write about nice people. This seems to be a common theme with regard to art. When art reaches a particular point where it becomes too black, that might become problematic. You only can write about nice people. We don't want to know about poverty and some of the evils experienced by African Americans as a result of slavery and segregation. But then you have added issues here. Be stereotyped. Don't go too far. Don't shatter our illusions about you. This reminds me of the show Good Times that we had talked about before, Good Times in the 1970s, when the main actor, the father, was arguing that the show was portraying African Americans in a negative way. He was written off of the show. He wanted to address real issues, but that did not seem to be the direction that the writers wanted to take that particular show. What other options would you have? Black Americans in the 1970s do not own any of the TV networks. So they would be at the mercy of what the white writers and producers are looking for. As we get to the last section, I am ashamed for the black poet who says, I want to be a poet, not a Negro poet. Langston Hughes is identifying that there is a difference. The task, you want to answer these questions. The last task that we're going to do, we've looked at two sources here. The one from Alan Locke, as well as Langston Hughes. And the task is to Google Harlem Renaissance and locate images that depict life in Harlem during the 1920s. Last part, you want to make sure you have an understanding of these terms. Hopefully you have completed the primary source sheet, and to verify your definitions using this slide.